Have you ever stopped to think about why your high school Spanish class felt so different from, say, the language app you're using on your phone right now? Well, it's because the way we teach and learn languages has gone through this absolutely massive evolution. Today, we're going to unpack the fascinating story of how we got here, from memorizing Latin verbs to chatting with AI.
You know, for hundreds of years, pretty much up into the 19th century, language class was based on one thing: how people learned Latin. It was super formal, totally academic. We're talking heavy books, endless lists of grammar rules, and just so much translation. The whole point wasn't to, order a coffee in Paris. It was to read ancient literature.
So yeah, how did we make the jump from that super rigid, book-heavy system to the interactive, communication-first methods we have today? Let's trace that journey.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the old-school classical method, then watch the first huge shift towards actually speaking. After that, we'll dive into the age of intense drills, witness a humanistic revolution that put the learner front and center, and finally, we'll land in the modern classroom. It's quite a story.
All right, first up, the classical method. This is where it all began, and it was all about reading, writing, and a whole lot of memorization. The core of this whole thing was something called the grammar translation method. Now, what's really wild here is that language wasn't seen as a tool for talking to people. Nope, it was treated more like a mental workout, a way to train your brain by figuring out how to decode literature in another language. So this really breaks it down. The goal was just to read old texts. That's it. So the focus was 100% on memorizing grammar and vocab lists. Speaking and listening, completely ignored. In fact, most of the class was taught in the student's own language. And pronunciation? Yeah, that wasn't even on the radar. This mind map kind of gives you a feel for the complexity they were going for. Language was literally treated like a code that had to be cracked. The idea was, hey, if you could just master all these super intricate rules and memorize enough words, you can unlock any text. It was a very analytical, almost mathematical way of looking at it. But, and it's a big but, there was a major problem. You'd have students who could break down the most complex grammar, but they literally couldn't string together a simple sentence to save their lives. The method created scholars, not speakers. So as we get later into the 19th century, the world starts to feel a lot smaller. You've got more international trade, more travel, and suddenly there's a very new, very practical need. People actually have to talk to each other in different languages. And that change in society, it sparked the first huge revolution in teaching. And that brings us to the direct method. This was a complete 180 from the old way. The whole idea was to copy how kids learn their first language. And what does that mean? No more translation. The classroom basically became an immersion zone. It was all about intensive conversation, gestures, actions, all happening only in the target language. Now, this focus on speaking was a fantastic step, but it was often kinda unstructured. So around the middle of the 20th century, a new approach came along that tried to turn speaking practice into a science. And this led to the age of drills and the rise of a method called audiolingualism.
This method was hugely influenced by behaviorist psychology, which was the big scientific theory at the time. It basically said that our behaviors are just learned habits. So when they applied that to language, the idea was that speaking is just a set of habits you can form through endless repetition, like training a muscle. The number one goal was perfect, automatic accuracy.
Okay, if you have ever sat in a language lab with big headphones on, just repeating phrase over and over after a tape, listen and repeat. Where is the train station? Then, congratulations, you've experienced audiolingualism. The whole point was to drill those patterns until they were second nature. And errors? They were seen as bad habits that had to be stamped out immediately. But then, the famous linguist Noam Chomsky came along and pointed out a massive flaw in this whole theory. He argued that language isn't just a pile of habits we learn. It's an innate, creative skill we're born with. I mean, think about it. We can all say and understand sentences we've never, ever heard before. Pure imitation just can't explain that. And with that one powerful critique, the whole foundation of audiolingualism just started to crumble. Chomsky's ideas really opened the floodgates. At the same time, you've got the counterculture movements of the 60s and 70s, and the whole focus in education starts shifting to the individual. This kicked off a humanistic revolution in language teaching, a total explosion of creative, sometimes kind of weird but always human-centered new ideas. This slide just captures that shift perfectly. The goal went from perfect accuracy to just meaningful communication. The teacher was no longer this drill sergeant you had to imitate, but more of a guide. And mistakes? They weren't bad habits anymore. They were seen as a natural, totally necessary part of learning. So one of the most radical new methods to come out of this was the silent way. And the idea was simple. Get the student to talk as much as possible and the teacher to talk as little as possible. So the teacher would be mostly silent, using tools like these little colored rods to get students to speak, to figure out grammar on their own, and really develop some independence.
Another really cool one was total physical response, or TPR. This links language directly to movement. The teacher gives commands like stand up or walk to the door, and the students just do it. It's brilliant, really, because it lowers the stress of having to speak right away, and it kind of copies how we all learned as kids. It's super effective.
And maybe the most famous or infamous example of focusing on the learner's feelings was Suggestopedia. The idea was to make the classroom totally relaxing. We're talking comfy chairs, classical music, the whole 9 yards. The goal was to lower what they call the affective filter, which is basically that emotional wall that anxiety puts up so your brain could just absorb the new language effortlessly. So, where did all this amazing revolution lead? Well, it led us to the main approach used in pretty much every classroom today, the communicative approach, where the #1 focus is on meaning. The absolute key concept here is something called communicative competence. What that means is, it's not enough to just know the grammar rules. You also have to know how to use the language to get things done, to persuade someone, to tell a joke, to apologize, in a way that's actually appropriate for that situation. A modern classroom really takes the best of everything that came before. It's full of practical, real-life stuff, like role-playing a job interview or solving a puzzle together as a group. The teacher is a guide, not a dictator. And creating a low-stress environment, like we saw with Suggestopedia, is seen as absolutely essential. The goal is always, always real communication. So really, when you boil it all down, the entire history of language teaching has been this one incredible journey. We moved from obsessing over the language as an object, its rules, its parts, to focusing on the human being doing the learning, and on the messy, dynamic, wonderful act of communication itself. Which, of course, brings us to one final thought. We've gone from dusty Latin texts to real-time chats. But now, with powerful AI tutors and instant translations sitting right in our pockets, what do you think the next great revolution is going to be? What's the next chapter in this amazing story?